Joining me now to break down what it all means are Melissa Murray, MSNBC legal analyst, professor at NYU School of Law, and co-host of the podcast Strict Scrutiny. Neil Katyal, Saunders Professor of Law at Georgetown University and an MSNBC legal analyst. And Colorado Congressman Joe Neguse, a manager in Trump's second impeachment. Thank you all very much for coming to the Sunday show. The committee promised to show that Donald Trump was at the center of the action that unfolded on January 6th. In what we've seen so far, and with 3 days hindsight, how confident are you that they're going to credibly show that by the end of all of the hearings? Melissa, I'll start with you.
Well, I think it's clear that there is something here and that Donald Trump is at the center of it. And this thing, the insurrection at the Capitol and everything else with regard to the efforts to litigate the overthrowing of the election in state courts and in federal courts, all of this is related to Donald Trump. I think the real question is, do the American people actually hear this message? Do they understand what this means and that this threat isn't in the rearview mirror, but rather is prospective and will go forward into 2022 and the midterm elections and on to 2024 and the next presidential election?
Mm-hmm. Neil?
I'm 100% confident, Jonathan. I'm pleased that the hearing didn't focus just on the low-level folks who attacked the Capitol on January 6th, but it focused laser-like on Donald Trump. I think the committee was smart because it didn't let just the physical attack on January 6th be the whole story. I mean, after all, nobody woke up and decided for the first time that they thought the election was rigged or that they were going to go invade the Capitol. And I think one of the subtle questions that the committee is asking is, look, if it weren't for the attack, wouldn't it be worth investigating this plot anyway? The answer has to be a resounding yes, and the American public need to know about it. And in a weird way, focusing on just the attack lets Trump off the hook, because Trump wasn't, after all, on the scene on January 6th. There's no imagery of him breaking down the Capitol or something like that. And it's like a mob hit and a mob investigation. The question is the planning before that. What did Trump know? When did he know it? How could he have sat on his hands when he knew the Capitol was under attack? Wasn't that the whole plan? That's what the first committee hearing did so well, and I expect many more fireworks to come.
Congressman Neguse, of all the people on the screen right now, you are the only one who saw tons of evidence as an impeachment manager in Trump's second impeachment as a result of the January 6th insurrection. Your view of the first day of the hearings?
Well, good to be with you, Jonathan. Look, I share Neil's confidence. I don't think there's ever been any ambiguity about former President Trump's actions on January 6th and the actions that he took in the months and the days leading up to that fateful day for our republic. I don't think there's any debate about his involvement in terms of the effort to subvert the peaceful transfer of power. As you noted, that evidence was on full display during the course of the second impeachment trial in February of 2021. I do think last week's hearings were incredibly compelling, and I think the hearings to follow will be as well, because they underscore, to Melissa's point, a really salient point, the threat that remains today. Some of the revelations that were made during the course of that first hearing on Thursday are revelations that I and other colleagues of mine were not aware of, particularly around the breakdown of the constitutional order with respect to Vice President Pence's actions regarding the security of the Capitol campus and his conversations allegedly with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And of course, the president's abdication and dereliction of his duties under the Constitution to protect the Capitol was something we were already well aware of, but clearly putting a finer point on it. And I think really underscoring a point that we made during the course of the impeachment trial, which was that the threats that existed on January 6th and in the days and weeks that followed would ultimately remain if the Congress was unwilling to do anything about it. And I think the threats have metastasized in many ways, and it's important for the American public to have full transparency and knowledge of the same.
Now, on this issue of full transparency, Neil and Melissa, I want to hear from both of you, but I'll start with you, Melissa. The key caution in all of this, in watching these hearings, is that the January 6th hearings are not a court of law where there are rules of evidence and cross-examination of witnesses where the evidence can be challenged. So how much stock should the American people put in these hearings in terms of leading to accountability for Donald Trump and all those other folks who put this coup in motion?
Well, to be very clear, you're exactly right. The January 6th Special Committee doesn't have any prosecutorial authority here. It cannot bring any charges against Donald Trump or any of the other people who were involved in this. But what it can do is plead its case to the court of public opinion. And I think that's especially important in getting Americans to understand that this is not a past threat, but one that is ongoing and deepening. And more importantly, can lay out the case before the American people in the hopes that the Department of Justice, which will have the authority to prosecute anyone related to the January 6th insurrection, to give this sort of final push that will perhaps propel the Department of Justice to continue expanding its ongoing investigation. We've already seen some really important developments in the DOJ's investigation. We've seen some charges against individuals, including the leaders of the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. The question is, will that go further to those who were in the inner circle? And I think part of the hearing is not only about public education, but also about making the case that further action, legal action, is actually necessary to quell this threat.
And Neil, pick up on that. What's your view right now in terms of, I mean, if the January 6th committee, as Melissa said, has no prosecutorial power, that means all the attention is on the Department of Justice. Do you think the Department of Justice will pick up the prosecutorial baton and go after Donald Trump?
Well, I do agree that some of the attention is on the Justice Department, but I think there's actually three audiences. And the way I think about this is just like when I argue a big Supreme Court case, Jonathan. There's the audience of the 9 in front of me. There's the audience listening online and, in the world. And then there's the audience of history. And I feel the same thing about these hearings. There's the audience of the American public that Melissa's pointing to. There's the audience of the Justice Department, and there's the audience of history. And absolutely, there isn't cross-examination and all those things. Those are only true if the Justice Department picks up the baton and starts to prosecute against higher-level officials like Donald Trump. But I think what the committee has done so well is isolate the case against Donald Trump and ask, why is it that the Justice Department hasn't brought a prosecution yet? And there may be any number of reasons, but as this evidence generates, it's really hard for the Justice Department not to. We've already had a federal judge in California look at all this evidence and say it is more likely than not that Donald Trump committed felonies. And when you think about some of the testimony the committee gave, most powerfully Bill Barr, Trump's beloved former attorney general, calling Trump's claims about the election BS, it becomes devastating to Trump. I mean, if Bill Barr knows anything, I mean, the guy has a PhD in BS, and he's calling Trump's claims that.
Neil, to that point, let's have the American people hear Bill Barr in his own words. This is element 3, folks.
I made it clear I did not agree with the idea of saying the election was stolen and putting out this stuff, which I told the president was bull.
I respect Attorney General Barr. So I accepted what he was saying.
I mean, because it's Sunday, we bleeped out the cussing. But Congressman Neguse, I'm going to give the last question to you. It's a political question, and that is, did House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy make a mistake by not putting on 1 or 2 Republicans who could get approved by Speaker Pelosi, who also passed the laugh test, having folks on the committee who could be the interlocutor for the opposing view?
I certainly think so. I think it's confounding to me why the minority leader decided to take the steps that he did and essentially decided to not participate in the Select Committee's proceedings. But I just want to follow up on a point that Neil made, and I think he articulated it well. But there's a fourth audience for these hearings, and that is the United States Congress. I mean, the Congress is not powerless in all of this. Fundamentally, this is a legislative committee with a legislative purpose, and that is to make recommendations to the United States Congress about ways in which we can reform the laws that were weaponized by the former president and his acolytes in an attempt to subvert the peaceful transfer of power. We know that the Department of Justice was weaponized. We know that the Electoral Count Act, for example, is a archaic law on the books that unfortunately created the kind of ambiguities that more nefarious actors sought to weaponize during the last presidential election and the certification process. So there are steps that we can take today to ensure that we mitigate against any potential future threats to our republic down the line. And I think this committee's hearings are going to be an important part of that process.